The autumn of 1907 had settled over the Ozark Highlands like a quilt made from mist and dying leaves, transforming the ancient ridges and hidden hollers into a landscape where the past pressed against the present with uncomfortable intimacy, and where the silence between spoken words carried meanings that could determine whether a man lived to see another sunrise or disappeared into the kind of mystery that hill folk would discuss only in whispers, and then only when they were certain no one else was listening to their careful words. In these highlands where ridges ran like the knuckles of some sleeping giant, and where hollers cut deep into the earth like wounds that had never properly healed, there lived a family whose very name had become synonymous with a terror so complete and systematic that speaking their surname aloud was considered tantamount to writing one's own death warrant in blood and leaving it on a stump where the wrong people might find it before morning came to reveal what foolishness had been committed under cover of darkness. The Pritchard clan had lived in these mountains for 3 generations, their roots growing deep into soil that had been watered with more than rain, and their influence spreading through the community like poison oak that looked harmless enough until you brushed against it and discovered too late that some contacts left marks that never fully healed and served as permanent reminders of the danger that lurked in places where most people saw only ordinary wilderness, and empty hollers that seemed to hold nothing more threatening than shadows and the occasional deer track. But the Pritchard's power extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of mountain family influence, reaching into every aspect of community life through a network of fear and complicity that had been woven so carefully and systematically over the years that most folks no longer remembered how it had begun or when they had first learned that certain names were not to be spoken and certain questions were not to be asked if a person valued their health and wanted to avoid the kind of accidents that seemed to befall those who showed too much curiosity about matters that were none of their business. The physical boundary of Pritchard territory was marked not by fences or posted signs, but by subtler indicators that hill folk had learned to read with the same attention they paid to weather signs and animal tracks that warned of approaching storms or predators moving through the forest in search of prey that might not be adequately protected against the kind of hunger that could not be satisfied with ordinary food and required different kinds of sustenance to maintain its strength and continue its endless hunt for suitable victims. A lantern burning on the Pritchard porch during daylight hours meant that travelers should keep riding without stopping to rest their horses or ask for directions, no matter how lost they might be or how desperately they might need water for themselves and their animals. The signal was understood throughout the region as clearly as if it had been printed in the newspaper, though of course no newspaper would have dared to explain its meaning in print for fear of the consequences that would follow any public acknowledgement of the systems that governed life and death in the Highland communities. Dogs throughout the region had learned to avoid barking in the direction of Pritchard Hollow, their animal instincts warning them away from sounds or scents that carried threats their masters might not recognize, but which their more sensitive senses identified as dangerous to themselves and to the humans they served. The unnatural silence that surrounded the Pritchard property created an eerie atmosphere that made even seasoned woodsmen uncomfortable when their travels brought them within hearing distance of the family's holdings, though few would have been able to explain exactly what it was about the quiet that seemed so wrong. Even the fiddle players, who provided music for community gatherings, had learned to monitor their audiences carefully and to stop mid-tune if they noticed that the notes they were producing seemed to be forming patterns that might accidentally spell out the forbidden name or create musical references that could be interpreted as commentary on subjects that were not safe for public discussion. The musicians' sensitivity to their surroundings had become so refined that they could detect the slightest shift in audience mood that might indicate they were approaching dangerous territory in their musical selections. The postmistress in the nearest town had developed the habit of sliding certain letters back across the counter face down whenever she recognized handwriting or return addresses that might be connected to correspondence relating to the Pritchard family or their business affairs. She had never been explicitly instructed to intercept such mail, but her survival instincts had taught her to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when discretion was not just advisable, but essential for maintaining the kind of peaceful coexistence that kept communities functioning, despite the presence of elements that could destroy that peace if they were not handled with appropriate care and respect. The power that the Pritchards wielded over their community was based not on a single spectacular act of violence that had intimidated everyone into submission, but rather on a carefully maintained pattern of consequences that befell those who failed to show proper respect for the family's privacy and their desire to conduct their affairs without interference from law enforcement. Government officials or neighbors who might be tempted to share information with authorities who lacked sufficient understanding of Highland culture to appreciate the delicate balance that kept communities stable and relatively peaceful. Unlike the feuding families, whose violent conflicts made headlines in distant newspapers and attracted attention from outside authorities who came to the mountains with their own ideas about law and order, the Pritchards had learned that true power lay not in spectacular displays of force that drew unwelcome attention, but in the systematic cultivation of fear that operated through suggestion and implication rather than through direct threats that could be reported to authorities or used as evidence in legal proceedings that might disrupt the family's operations. The disappeared witnesses, stalled grand juries, and search parties that returned with nothing but churned leaves and cut rope represented a pattern of intimidation that was far more sophisticated than the crude violence that characterized most mountain feuds. The Pritchards had developed methods for eliminating problems that were subtle enough to avoid creating martyrs or generating the kind of outrage that might motivate outside intervention, while still being effective enough to maintain the atmosphere of fear that kept potential witnesses silent and prevented the formation of organized opposition to their activities. The family's business interests extended throughout the region's illegal whiskey trade, but their involvement was structured in ways that made it difficult for law enforcement to gather evidence or build cases that could withstand scrutiny in court proceedings, where defense attorneys might challenge the reliability of witnesses who had obvious reasons to fear retaliation for their testimony. The Pritchards had learned to insulate themselves from direct involvement in activities that carried legal risks, while still maintaining control over distribution networks and territorial boundaries that determined which competitors were allowed to operate and which were encouraged to find other lines of work. Their timber operations were conducted through a complex system of informal partnerships and verbal agreements that left few paper trails for investigators to follow, while still generating substantial income from the harvest of valuable hardwoods that grew on land, whose ownership was often unclear due to incomplete surveys and conflicting claims that could be resolved in various ways depending on how much influence the disputing parties possessed with local officials who made decisions about such matters. But perhaps most importantly, the Pritchards had recognized that their long-term survival and prosperity depended not just on their ability to intimidate enemies and eliminate witnesses, but on their capacity to cultivate relationships with community leaders who possessed the authority to make their problems disappear through official channels that were more effective and less risky than the traditional mountain methods of settling disputes through violence that often created new problems, even as it resolved old ones. The deputy sheriff, who patrolled the region containing Pritchard territory, had developed a remarkable ability to be elsewhere whenever incidents occurred that might require him to investigate activities or interview witnesses whose testimony could prove embarrassing to influential families who valued their privacy and had the means to express their displeasure with law enforcement officers who showed excessive enthusiasm for their duties. His consistent absence from scenes where his presence might have been expected had become so predictable that planning illegal activities around his patrol schedule had become a standard practice among those who needed to avoid official attention. The storekeeper who served the scattered communities throughout the Highland region had learned that extending credit to certain customers was not just good business practice, but essential for maintaining the kind of peaceful relationships that allowed commerce to continue without the disruptions that could result from demanding immediate payment from people who might interpret such requests as signs of disrespect or attempts to create financial pressure that could interfere with their other obligations and commitments. Even the traveling preacher who conducted services in the small churches scattered throughout the mountains had discovered that his prayers for the community's welfare were most effective when they avoided specific references to particular families or recent events that might be interpreted as taking sides in disputes that were better left to be resolved through unofficial channels that operated according to traditions that predated formal legal systems and often provided more satisfactory outcomes for all parties involved. The code of silence that protected the Pritchards was maintained not through explicit threats or formal agreements, but through a shared understanding that had developed over years of experience with the consequences that befell those who failed to show appropriate discretion in their conversations and their business dealings. Community members had learned to speak in coded language that used references to weather patterns, road conditions, and seasonal activities to discuss matters that could not be addressed directly without creating risks that prudent people preferred to avoid. Children growing up in these communities learned from their earliest years to recognize the subtle signals that indicated when conversations were entering dangerous territory and when it was time to find other activities that would take them away from discussions that were not appropriate for young ears to hear. Their education in survival skills included not just the traditional mountain knowledge of hunting, farming, and woodcraft, but also the more specialized skills of social navigation that could mean the difference between a long, peaceful life and the kind of shortened existence that resulted from asking too many questions or showing too much interest in subjects that were better left unexplored. The physical geography of the region contributed to the effectiveness of the Pritchards' control system by providing numerous hidden locations where activities could be conducted without observation by casual travelers or curious neighbors who might be tempted to share information with authorities who lacked the local knowledge necessary to distinguish between activities that were merely unconventional and those that represented genuine threats to community safety and stability. The maze of ridges, hollers, and creek bottoms created natural barriers that could be used to channel the movement of people and goods in ways that made surveillance and interdiction difficult for outside authorities, while providing advantages to those who possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain. The seasonal rhythms of mountain life also worked to the family's advantage by providing natural explanations for activities and movements that might otherwise attract unwelcome attention from people who were not familiar with the legitimate reasons why groups of men might gather at certain times and places, or why particular routes through the forest might be heavily traveled during periods when such traffic would seem unusual to outside observers who lacked understanding of the economic and social cycles that governed Highland communities. The Pritchards' reputation had grown over the years, not through boastful claims about their power or public displays of their willingness to use violence against those who opposed them, but through the accumulation of stories and rumors that spread through the community like smoke from a forest fire, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that was more effective than any direct threat, because it left people's imaginations free to conjure possibilities that were often more terrifying than any reality could have been. The folklore that surrounded the family included tales of supernatural abilities and otherworldly connections that elevated their threat level beyond mere physical danger into realms of spiritual and psychological terror that could not be addressed through conventional means of protection and resistance. Whether these stories had any basis in fact was less important than their effect on community behavior and the way they influenced people's decisions about when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act, and when to avoid any action that might be interpreted as opposition or interference. The most chilling aspect of the Pritchard legend was not the violence that was attributed to them, but the systematic way in which evidence of their activities seemed to vanish before it could be used against them in legal proceedings or community actions that might have limited their power and influence. Witnesses developed sudden memory problems when asked to testify about events they had previously described in detail. Documents disappeared from government offices, and physical evidence seemed to deteriorate or become contaminated in ways that made it useless for law enforcement purposes. This pattern of evidence destruction was so consistent and thorough that many people began to believe that the family possessed supernatural powers that enabled them to manipulate reality itself in ways that protected them from the normal consequences of their actions. Whether such beliefs were accurate was less important than their effect on community behavior and the way they reinforced the atmosphere of fear and helplessness that prevented organized opposition from developing against the Pritchards' continued dominance of regional affairs. As the autumn of 1907 deepened and winter approached with its promise of isolation and reduced travel that would make communication between scattered communities more difficult, the silence that surrounded the Pritchard name seemed to grow heavier and more oppressive, weighing on the consciousness of everyone who lived within the sphere of their influence and serving as a constant reminder that some powers were too dangerous to challenge and some truths were too terrible to speak aloud. Even in the privacy of one's own home, where the walls themselves seemed to have ears that reported back to those who had the most to gain from knowing what their neighbors were thinking and planning in the quiet hours when most people believed themselves to be safe from observation and retribution. The name that could not be spoken had become more than just a surname. It had evolved into a symbol of the kind of fear that could reshape entire communities and alter the basic patterns of human interaction in ways that served the interests of those who understood how to manipulate the psychological and social forces that governed behavior in isolated regions where traditional forms of law and order had limited effectiveness, and where survival often depended on the ability to recognize and respect power structures that operated according to their own mysterious logic and unforgiving rules. The pattern that made the Pritchard clan so terrifying was not written in courthouse records or newspaper accounts, but rather in the careful silences that surrounded certain events and the systematic way in which evidence seemed to vanish before it could threaten the family's operations or bring unwelcome attention from outside authorities who might not understand the delicate balance that governed life and death in the Highland communities, where traditional law enforcement had limited effectiveness and where justice often operated according to older, more immediate principles than those taught in law schools or codified in statute books. The disappearance of witnesses followed a predictable sequence that began with initial cooperation with law enforcement investigations and gradually progressed through stages of reluctance, recantation, and finally complete absence from the region, as those who had once seemed willing to testify against Pritchard interests discovered that their continued presence in familiar communities had become incompatible with their personal safety and the welfare of their families, who might suffer consequences for the indiscretions of relatives who had failed to show appropriate discretion in their dealings with official authorities. Grand juries that were convened to investigate incidents involving Pritchard business interests found themselves unable to proceed with their deliberations due to the mysterious unavailability of key witnesses whose testimony had been expected to provide the foundation for criminal charges that might have disrupted the family's operations and challenged their control over regional affairs that had been carefully arranged to minimize official interference while maximizing profit and influence through methods that operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal activity. The search parties that were organized to locate missing persons or investigate crime scenes connected to Pritchard territory invariably returned with reports of churned earth and cut rope that suggested violent struggle, but provided no concrete evidence that could be used to support formal charges against specific individuals or organizations whose involvement in the disappearances could not be proven through the kinds of evidence that would satisfy judges and juries who required more than suspicion and circumstantial connections to justify legal action against defendants who possessed sufficient resources and influence to mount effective defenses. The rival stillhouse that had been operating in direct competition with Pritchard whiskey interests was discovered one morning to have gone completely cold overnight, with its copper equipment removed so thoroughly and efficiently that no trace remained of the complex distillation apparatus that had been producing high-quality spirits for regional distribution until someone decided that the competition had become inconvenient and needed to be eliminated through methods that left no opportunity for the operators to resume their business activities or seek compensation for their losses through legal or unofficial channels. The copper from the dismantled still was sold in distant markets before sunrise, transported by buyers who had arrived with wagons and the kind of cash payments that discouraged questions about ownership or the circumstances under which the equipment had become available for immediate purchase at prices that reflected the seller's desire for rapid disposal rather than maximum profit from their investment in the sophisticated apparatus that had required considerable skill and expense to construct and maintain. The betting drifter who had appeared at a barn dance with more money than seemed appropriate for his apparent circumstances had entertained the local community with stories of successful gambling operations in distant cities and had demonstrated his skill at various games of chance that involved cards, dice, and other instruments of fortune that could generate substantial winnings for those who possess sufficient knowledge and nerve to exploit the mathematical advantages that were invisible to less sophisticated players who relied on luck rather than systematic understanding of probability and human psychology. But his disappearance following the dance was discovered only when his horse was found wandering loose several days later, with its saddle intact, but its rider nowhere to be found, despite extensive searches of the surrounding territory that revealed no trace of the man or any indication of what might have happened to him during the interval between his last appearance at the community gathering and the discovery of his abandoned mount by farmers who recognized the animal but had no knowledge of where its owner might have gone. The county man, who had been scheduled to provide testimony about land ownership disputes that could have affected Pritchard timber operations, was found missing from his home on the morning he was supposed to appear before a grand jury that had been investigating irregularities in property transfers and timber rights that seemed to favor certain families while disadvantaging others who lacked the political connections necessary to protect their interests through official channels that were supposed to provide equal treatment for all citizens regardless of their social status or financial resources. His wagon was discovered overturned beside a mountain road, with its traces cut cleanly rather than broken through accident or natural wear. suggesting deliberate sabotage rather than the kind of mechanical failure that might have resulted from poor maintenance or excessive loading that could have caused the leather to snap under stress during normal travel over rough terrain that challenged even well-maintained equipment and experienced drivers who understood how to navigate the hazardous conditions that characterized mountain transportation routes. The mule that had been pulling the wagon was found several miles uphill from the accident site, turned loose but unharmed, and showing no signs of the kind of injuries that might have been expected if the animal had been involved in a genuine accident that had resulted in the overturning of its load and the disappearance of its driver, who had been traveling alone through territory where assistance might not be readily available if problems developed during the journey. The systematic nature of these disappearances created a pattern that was obvious to anyone who possessed sufficient knowledge of local events and the context in which they had occurred, but which could not be easily documented or proven through the kinds of evidence that would support formal legal action against individuals or organizations whose involvement could only be inferred through circumstantial connections that might not satisfy the standards of proof required by courts that operated according to procedures designed to protect defendants from prosecution based solely on suspicion and community prejudice. The effectiveness of this pattern lay not in its subtlety, which was minimal to those who understood the regional dynamics, but in its systematic thoroughness and the way it created an atmosphere of inevitability that discouraged potential witnesses from cooperating with investigations or providing testimony that might make them targets for similar treatment by forces that had demonstrated their ability to eliminate problems before they could develop into serious threats to established power structures and business arrangements. The timing of these incidents was carefully coordinated to maximize their impact on ongoing legal proceedings, while minimizing the risk that their obvious connections to Pritchard interests could be used as evidence of a criminal conspiracy that might attract federal attention or other forms of outside intervention that could not be controlled through local influence and unofficial pressure that had proven effective in managing regional law enforcement and judicial authorities who understood the importance of maintaining peaceful coexistence with powerful families. The methods used to eliminate witnesses and evidence were chosen not for their dramatic impact or their capacity to send messages to potential opponents, but rather for their effectiveness in creating permanent solutions to temporary problems, while avoiding the kinds of spectacular violence that might generate newspaper coverage or attract attention from government agencies whose involvement could not be easily managed through the informal networks of influence and obligation that had proven so successful in neutralizing local threats to Pritchard operations. The disappearance of physical evidence followed patterns that suggested systematic planning and coordination, rather than random criminal activity or the kinds of spontaneous violence that characterized most mountain feuds and family conflicts. Documents vanished from government offices during periods when security was relaxed, and few people were present to observe unauthorized access to files and records that contained information that could have supported legal action against individuals whose activities might otherwise have continued without official interference. Weapons that might have been used as evidence in criminal proceedings were discovered to have been damaged or contaminated in ways that made forensic analysis impossible or unreliable, while other physical evidence seemed to deteriorate at rates that exceeded normal expectations and rendered it useless for law enforcement purposes before investigators could complete their examinations and prepare their reports for submission to prosecutors who required reliable evidence to support charges that could withstand defense challenges in court proceedings. The coordination required to execute this systematic evidence destruction suggested the involvement of individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of law enforcement procedures and investigative techniques, as well as access to official facilities and records that would normally be protected against unauthorized interference by people who lacked legitimate authority to examine or modify materials that were being held for potential use in criminal prosecutions or civil proceedings that might affect property rights and business interests. The financial resources necessary to maintain such an extensive network of influence and corruption implied income levels that exceeded what could be generated through traditional mountain economic activities such as farming, logging, and small-scale manufacturing, suggesting involvement in more lucrative enterprises that operated outside the boundaries of legal commerce and required the kinds of protection from official interference that could only be purchased through systematic cultivation of relationships with individuals who possess the authority to make problems disappear through official channels. The psychological impact of this pattern on potential witnesses and community members who might otherwise have been willing to cooperate with law enforcement investigations was profound and lasting, creating an atmosphere of helplessness and inevitability that discouraged resistance while reinforcing the perception that the Pritchards possessed resources and capabilities that exceeded those available to their opponents and made successful opposition unlikely, regardless of the moral justification or legal authority that might support such efforts. The geographic scope of the pattern suggested coordination across multiple counties and jurisdictions, implying political influence that extended beyond local offices and included relationships with state-level officials who possessed the authority to direct or influence federal investigations that might otherwise have been initiated in response to evidence of interstate criminal activity or violations of federal laws that fell outside the jurisdiction of local authorities who had proven inadequate to address crimes that crossed county boundaries or involved federal crimes. The duration of the pattern, which had been developing over several years without significant interruption or successful challenge from law enforcement agencies, suggested that the system supporting it had been designed for long-term operation rather than short-term advantage, implying strategic planning and institutional development that treated criminal enterprise as a business requiring the same kinds of systematic management and protective measures that characterized legitimate commercial operations competing in regulated markets. The sophistication of the methods used to maintain the pattern indicated access to specialized knowledge and professional expertise that would not normally be available to rural criminal organizations, suggesting connections to urban crime networks or corrupt officials who possessed the technical knowledge necessary to design and implement systems for evidence destruction and witness intimidation that could operate effectively over extended periods without detection or successful prosecution by law enforcement agencies that lacked equivalent resources and expertise. The success of the pattern in neutralizing potential threats to Pritchard operations while avoiding the kinds of spectacular violence that might have attracted unwelcome attention from outside authorities demonstrated a level of strategic discipline and long-term thinking that distinguished the family's approach from the more typical mountain criminal activities that relied on immediate intimidation and crude violence to achieve short-term objectives, without adequate consideration of the long-term consequences that such methods might create for sustained criminal enterprise. The community's gradual acceptance of the pattern as a normal aspect of regional life reflected the effectiveness of systematic psychological conditioning that had transformed extraordinary criminal activity into expected background conditions that influence behavior and decision-making without requiring conscious acknowledgement of the forces that were shaping individual choices and community. Responses to events that might otherwise have generated organized opposition or appeals for outside assistance in addressing problems that local authorities had proven unable or unwilling to resolve through conventional law enforcement methods, The pattern of fear had become so deeply embedded in the social fabric of the Highland communities that most residents no longer consciously recognized its influence on their daily lives. Having adapted their behavior and expectations to accommodate realities that they could not change, and had learned to accept as permanent features of their environment rather than temporary problems that might be resolved through collective action or appeals to higher authorities who possessed greater resources and legal authority than local officials who had demonstrated their limitations in dealing with sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated according to principles that exceeded their understanding and capabilities. The power that sustained the Pritchard clan's dominance over the Highland communities was not built solely on fear and violence, but rather on a complex web of mutually beneficial relationships and carefully negotiated accommodations that allowed ordinary citizens to maintain their daily lives and pursue their modest ambitions while avoiding the kinds of conflicts that could result in the sort of permanent disappearances that had become an accepted, if unspoken, reality of regional existence. The community had entered into an unwritten social contract that traded silence and selective blindness for the relative peace and stability that enabled families to raise their children, operate their businesses, and worship in their churches without constant fear of becoming collateral damage in conflicts that they neither understood nor possessed the resources to influence through conventional means. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Whitley represented the most visible symbol of official law enforcement's accommodation with Pritchard power, though his role was defined more by strategic absence than active collaboration with criminal enterprises that operated beyond the reach of his limited authority and inadequate resources. Whitley had learned through experience that his survival and effectiveness as a peace officer in the Highlands depended not on zealous enforcement of laws that could not be practically implemented without community support, but rather on his ability to maintain order through selective intervention that focused on problems he could actually solve while avoiding entanglement in disputes that would only result in his own elimination and replacement by someone who might prove even less effective in protecting the interests of law-abiding citizens who needed some form of official protection. The deputy's patrol schedule had evolved over the years to accommodate the operational requirements of various illegal enterprises while still maintaining sufficient visibility to reassure citizens that law enforcement remained present in the region, even if its effectiveness was limited by practical constraints that reflected the realities of mountain geography, inadequate funding, and political pressures that made certain types of investigations inadvisable for officers who valued their careers and their physical well-being. Whitley's routes and timing had become predictable enough to allow criminal activities to be planned around his movements, but unpredictable enough to maintain the illusion that his presence represented a genuine deterrent to lawless behavior. The deputy's remarkable ability to be elsewhere whenever incidents occurred that might require him to investigate Pritchard activities or interview witnesses whose testimony could prove embarrassing to influential families had become so consistent and reliable that it was factored into the planning of illegal operations with the same precision that legitimate businesses use to schedule their activities around government office hours and postal delivery schedules. His absence from crime scenes was so systematic that it could only have been achieved through advanced knowledge of when and where his presence might prove inconvenient for people whose displeasure could have serious consequences for his continued employment and personal safety. But Whitley's accommodation with Pritchard power was not based solely on fear or corruption in the conventional sense, but rather on his pragmatic recognition that effective law enforcement in the Highlands required community cooperation that could only be maintained through careful attention to local power structures and informal systems of authority that often superseded official legal frameworks in determining how disputes were resolved and how justice was administered in communities where federal and state authority had limited practical influence over daily life and social relationships. Samuel Morrison, the storekeeper who served the scattered Highland communities from his establishment at the junction of three mountain roads, had developed his own methods for maintaining peaceful coexistence with the Pritchard clan while still operating a profitable business that provided essential goods and services to customers who represented every faction and interest group in the region. Morrison's store had become neutral territory, where competing interests could conduct necessary transactions without the kinds of confrontations that might escalate into violence. But maintaining this neutrality required constant attention to the subtle dynamics that governed relationships between families, whose disputes could destroy businesses that became associated with the wrong side in conflicts that often had roots in grievances that stretched back for generations. The storekeeper's policy of extending credit to certain customers reflected his understanding that immediate payment for goods and services was less important than maintaining the kinds of relationships that allowed his business to continue operating without interference from powerful families who possessed the ability to destroy his livelihood through economic pressure, physical intimidation, or other methods that could make continued operation impossible. The credit arrangements that Morrison offered to Pritchard associates were not documented in the same way as those provided to other customers, reflecting recognition that certain transactions were better left unrecorded to avoid creating evidence that might prove embarrassing or dangerous if examined by investigators or competitors who might use such information to their advantage. Morrison's careful maintenance of inventory that satisfied the needs of customers involved in various illegal enterprises without creating obvious evidence of his knowledge about their activities required sophisticated understanding of the regional economy and the ways in which legitimate commerce intersected with criminal operations that generated substantial cash income that could be converted into purchases of legal goods and services. His ability to obtain certain items that were not readily available through normal wholesale channels reflected connections to suppliers who operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal commerce, providing goods that served multiple purposes and could be justified as serving legitimate needs while actually supporting activities that operated outside the boundaries of law and regulation. The storekeeper's role as an informal banker for customers who needed to convert cash from questionable sources into credit for legitimate purchases served important functions in the regional economy while also providing him with detailed knowledge of financial flows and business relationships that could be valuable to law enforcement agencies if he could be convinced to cooperate with investigations. But Morrison's survival and prosperity depended on his ability to provide these services without creating records or documentation that could be used as evidence against his customers, requiring systems of accounting and record-keeping that satisfied business needs while protecting both himself and his clients from exposure to official scrutiny. Reverend Jonathan Hayes, the traveling preacher who conducted religious services in the small churches scattered throughout the mountain communities, had developed his own approach to maintaining spiritual authority while avoiding entanglement in temporal conflicts that could undermine his effectiveness as a religious leader and threaten his safety in communities where the wrong sermon could have consequences that extended far beyond disappointing congregations or reducing collection plate contributions. Hayes had learned to craft prayers and sermons that addressed community concerns and moral issues without making specific references to individuals, families, or recent events that might be interpreted as taking sides in disputes that were better left to be resolved through unofficial channels. The preacher's prayers for community welfare and divine protection were carefully worded to avoid naming particular threats or asking for intervention in specific conflicts, relying instead on general appeals for peace and justice that could be interpreted in ways that satisfied different factions without committing the church to positions that might prove politically dangerous or morally compromising. Hayes's approach to pastoral counseling similarly emphasized general principles and scriptural guidance, rather than specific advice about practical problems that might require him to advocate positions that could create enemies among powerful families whose support was essential for his continued ability to minister to congregations that needed spiritual guidance but could not provide adequate protection for religious leaders who became too closely identified with particular interests or causes. The traveling preacher's survival in communities where religious authority intersected with temporal power required diplomatic skills that exceeded those needed by ministers who served more conventional congregations in settled areas where church and state maintained clearer boundaries, and where religious leaders could rely on institutional protections that were not available to individual ministers operating in regions where personal relationships and informal agreements determined the practical limits of religious freedom and spiritual independence. But the most complex and dangerous aspect of Hayes's ministry involved his role as a keeper of confessions and spiritual secrets that included knowledge of criminal activities and moral transgressions that could destroy individuals and families if revealed to secular authorities or used as weapons in community conflicts. The preacher's obligation to maintain confidentiality about information shared during pastoral counseling created situations where his silence protected criminals while his speech could endanger innocent people, requiring moral judgments that were not adequately addressed by seminary training or denominational guidelines that had been developed for more conventional ministry situations. The community's children learned from their earliest years to navigate the complex social environment created by the Pritchard's influence and the various accommodations that adults had made to maintain relative peace and stability in communities where open conflict could have devastating consequences for families who lacked the resources to protect themselves or relocate to safer regions. Children's games and conversations were monitored by parents who understood that inappropriate comments or questions could create dangers that extended beyond immediate family members to include extended relatives and family friends who might suffer consequences for the indiscretions of young people who had not yet learned to recognize the boundaries that governed acceptable behavior in communities where certain topics were not suitable for discussion, regardless of context or audience. The education of Highland children included lessons in reading social cues and recognizing conversational danger signs that were as important for survival as traditional academic subjects or practical skills like farming, hunting, and woodcraft that prepared them for adult responsibilities in mountain communities. Children learned to identify the subtle changes in adult behavior that indicated when conversations were entering dangerous territory and when their presence was no longer welcome, developing sensitivity to social dynamics that exceeded what would be expected in more conventional communities where such skills were not essential for physical safety and social acceptance. The community's informal communication networks operated according to protocols that protected sensitive information while still allowing necessary coordination of activities that required cooperation between individuals and families who might otherwise prefer to minimize their contact due to political differences or personal animosities that could create problems if not carefully managed. These communication systems used coded language and indirect references that allowed important information to be shared without creating evidence that could be used against participants if intercepted by hostile parties or official investigators who might not understand the context or significance of conversations that appeared innocent to outsiders but carried important meaning for community. Members who possessed the cultural knowledge necessary to interpret references to weather patterns, agricultural activities, and seasonal changes that actually described business relationships, territorial boundaries, and temporal restrictions that governed illegal activities. The effectiveness of these informal networks depended on community members' ability to maintain discipline and discretion that exceeded what would be required in conventional social situations, creating social pressures and expectations that reinforced the silence and selective blindness that protected the Pritchards' operations, while allowing ordinary citizens to pursue their daily activities without constant fear of inadvertent involvement in conflicts that could result in permanent disappearance or other forms of retaliation that could destroy families and eliminate entire bloodlines. From communities where kinship relationships provided the foundation for social organization and mutual protection, the economic relationships that bound the community to Pritchard interests were complex and multifaceted, involving legitimate business activities that provided employment and income for families who might otherwise have been forced to relocate to more prosperous regions, as well as illegal operations that generated cash income that circulated throughout the local economy and supported businesses and institutions that might not have been viable without this additional source of revenue. The interdependence between legal and illegal economic activities made it difficult for community members to oppose Pritchard power without threatening their own financial security and the welfare of their families who depended on the stability and prosperity that the clan's operations provided, despite their illegal nature and the moral compromises that were required to maintain them. The community's bargain with the Pritchards was not a formal agreement negotiated through official channels or documented in written contracts, but rather an organic social arrangement that had evolved over time through trial and error, accommodation and resistance, cooperation and conflict that had gradually established norms and expectations that allowed different interests to coexist while minimizing the friction and violence that could have destroyed the delicate balance that enabled both legal and illegal activities to flourish in communities where official law enforcement had limited effectiveness and where alternative systems of authority and justice provided the stability that federal and state governments were unable to guarantee through conventional means. The success of this arrangement depended on the community's collective understanding that certain compromises were necessary for survival, and that the moral purity that might be possible in more settled and secure regions was not a practical option in Highland communities, where the choice was often between accommodation with powerful criminal interests and complete social and economic destruction that could eliminate entire communities. From regions where alternative economic opportunities were limited and where geographic isolation made relocation difficult or impossible for families who lacked the resources to establish themselves in new locations where they might not possess the social connections and cultural knowledge necessary for successful adaptation. The community's bargain represented a form of collective survival strategy that prioritized practical results over abstract moral principles, allowing families to maintain their homes, raise their children, and preserve their cultural traditions in environments where rigid adherence to conventional legal and moral standards could have resulted in their elimination or displacement by forces that operated according to different principles and possessed superior resources for achieving their objectives, regardless of the human cost that such achievements might require from people who lacked equivalent power and influence. The young man who would shatter the careful silence that had protected the Pritchard clan for nearly a decade was Thomas Edward Pritchard himself. Barely 22 years old and married into the family through his union with Clara Pritchard, the youngest daughter of the clan's patriarch, Ezekiel Pritchard, whose iron control over family affairs had maintained the discipline and secrecy that enabled their criminal enterprise to flourish without interference from law enforcement agencies that had proven inadequate to penetrate the wall of fear and complicity that surrounded the family's operations in the remote Highland communities where traditional authority structures had limited practical influence over daily life and social relationships. Thomas had arrived in the Ozark Highlands from the lowland counties of Arkansas, drawn by the promise of steady employment in the timber industry and the opportunity to marry into a family whose reputation for prosperity and influence suggested that his future would be more secure and profitable than anything he might achieve in the overcrowded agricultural regions where economic opportunities were limited and competition for available land and employment was intense among young men who lacked the family connections and accumulated capital necessary to establish independent farming operations or successful business enterprises that could support growing families and provide stability through economic uncertainty. But Thomas's outsider status and his unfamiliarity with the unwritten codes that governed behavior in Highland communities, where silence was not just a social courtesy, but a survival skill, had made him unsuitable for full integration into the Pritchard family's criminal operations, relegating him to peripheral roles in legitimate business activities, while excluding him from direct knowledge of the illegal enterprises that generated the wealth and power that had attracted him to the region. His position as an in-law rather than a blood relative had created automatic limitations on his access to sensitive information and decision-making processes that maintained operational security while protecting the family from exposure through indiscretion or betrayal by members whose loyalty might be compromised by divided allegiances or external pressures. The gradual deterioration of Thomas's relationship with his wife and her family had been precipitated not by dramatic conflicts or violent confrontations, but rather by the accumulation of small slights, exclusions, and reminders of his outsider status that had worn away his initial enthusiasm for Highland life and his respect for the Pritchard family's methods and priorities. His growing awareness that his marriage had been arranged primarily to provide legitimate cover for family activities rather than to create genuine partnership and mutual affection had created resentment and disappointment that made him increasingly receptive to approaches from law enforcement agencies that were seeking inside information about criminal activities that had remained impervious to conventional investigative techniques. The federal agents who had been conducting a long-term investigation into illegal whiskey operations throughout the Ozark region had identified Thomas as a potentially valuable source of information about Pritchard family activities. Recognizing that his position within the family combined access to useful intelligence with motivations for cooperation that might overcome the loyalty and fear that had prevented other potential witnesses from providing testimony that could support criminal prosecutions against individuals whose influence and resources had previously made them untouchable through normal law enforcement channels. Agent Samuel Richardson, who had been working undercover in the region for more than 8 months while developing relationships and gathering intelligence about criminal networks that operated across state and county boundaries, had approached Thomas through intermediaries who possessed legitimate reasons for contact that would not arouse suspicion among family members who maintained constant surveillance of activities and relationships that might threaten operational security or expose the family to investigation by federal authorities whose resources and jurisdiction exceeded those available to local law enforcement. Agencies that had proven inadequate to address sophisticated criminal enterprises. The initial contacts between Thomas and federal investigators had been carefully structured to provide him with opportunities to withdraw from cooperation if he developed concerns about his safety or the consequences that his family might suffer if his collaboration with law enforcement became known to Pritchard family members whose response to betrayal had been demonstrated through the disappearances and deaths that had eliminated previous threats to their operations. The agents had emphasized that their investigation was focused on illegal whiskey operations, rather than the more serious crimes that had created the atmosphere of fear surrounding the Pritchard name. Hoping that Thomas might be willing to provide information about liquor violations that carried less severe penalties and generated less intense retaliation than testimony about murder and intimidation. But Thomas's decision to cooperate fully with federal investigators was motivated by factors that exceeded concerns about legal consequences or personal safety, reflecting his growing recognition that his continued association with the Pritchard family would inevitably result in his own moral corruption and criminal liability as the scope of their operations expanded and the methods used to maintain their power became increasingly violent and indiscriminate. His conscience had been troubled by his knowledge of activities that violated not only federal and state laws, but also the basic moral principles that had governed his upbringing in communities where violence was employed only in self-defense and where criminal behavior was considered shameful rather than profitable. The information that Thomas provided to federal investigators during a series of clandestine meetings held in locations far from Pritchard territory included detailed descriptions of family hierarchy and decision-making processes, precise locations of illegal distilleries and storage facilities, schedules and routes used for transporting products to regional markets, names and roles of associates and employees who participated in various aspects of the criminal enterprise, and most importantly, specific dates and circumstances surrounding disappearances and deaths that had previously been impossible to investigate due to lack of witnesses and physical evidence. His testimony included information about the tools and weapons that had been used in various crimes, describing not only the instruments of violence, but also the systematic methods by which evidence had been destroyed and crime scenes had been sanitized to prevent forensic analysis that might have supported criminal prosecutions. Thomas had observed the family's evidence destruction procedures during his peripheral involvement in cleanup operations that were conducted following incidents that required careful management to avoid attracting official attention or creating opportunities for investigators to develop leads that might threaten the family's continued operations. The ridge paths and hidden routes that Thomas described in his testimony provided federal agents with detailed knowledge of transportation networks that had been invisible to previous investigations, including seasonal variations in usage patterns that reflected weather conditions and law enforcement activities that influenced the timing and routing of illegal shipments. His insider knowledge of these logistical systems enabled investigators to plan surveillance operations and coordinate enforcement actions that could intercept criminal activities without alerting the perpetrators to the source of information that had made such operations possible. But the most dangerous aspect of Thomas's cooperation with federal investigators was his willingness to provide testimony about specific individuals and their roles in crimes that carried serious federal penalties, including detailed descriptions of planning meetings and decision-making processes that had resulted in the elimination of witnesses and competitors whose activities had threatened Pritchard interests. His knowledge of the family's systematic approach to violence and intimidation provided investigators with insights into operational methods that had previously been matters of speculation and rumor, rather than documented fact that could support criminal prosecutions. The Pritchard family's discovery of Thomas's betrayal came through their sophisticated network of informants and surveillance systems that monitored community activities and relationships for signs of disloyalty or collaboration with law enforcement agencies whose investigations posed existential threats to criminal operations that had provided the foundation for family prosperity and regional influence. The evidence of Thomas's cooperation with federal agents was conclusive and undeniable, including documentation of his meetings with investigators and copies of testimony that he had provided during formal proceedings that were intended to support grand jury indictments against multiple family members. The family's response to Thomas's betrayal was swift and systematic, beginning with his immediate exclusion from all family activities and the termination of his employment in legitimate business operations that had provided his primary source of income and social identity within the Highland communities, where economic opportunities were limited and where loss of family connections could result in complete social and economic isolation. But the Pritchards' retaliation extended beyond mere ostracism to include active measures designed to eliminate the threat that Thomas's continued existence posed to family security and operational effectiveness. The house fire that consumed Thomas and Clara's modest dwelling occurred during the early hours of a moonless night, when visibility was limited and when the remote location of their home made rapid response by firefighting efforts impossible, despite the best efforts of neighbors who were awakened by the sound of screaming and the glow of flames that could be seen for miles across the Highland terrain. The fire burned with unusual intensity and speed, consuming the wooden structure so completely that little remained for investigation by officials who arrived hours after the flames had died down to smoldering ruins that provided few clues about the cause of the conflagration or the fate of its occupants. The bridge that had provided the primary access route to Thomas and Clara's home was discovered the following morning to have been freshly axed through its main supporting timbers, creating a gap that made crossing impossible for the firefighting equipment that might have been able to save the structure and its occupants if it had been able to reach the scene while suppression efforts could still have been effective. The precision of the cuts and the timing of the sabotage suggested systematic planning and coordination rather than random vandalism or accidental damage that might have occurred through natural causes or ordinary wear and deterioration. The white sheet that appeared on a clothesline visible from the main road leading to the Pritchard family compound was recognized throughout the community as a signal that enough blood had been shed to satisfy family honor, and that no further retaliation was planned against individuals who had not been directly involved in the betrayal that had threatened the family's security and operational effectiveness. The sheet remained in place for exactly 3 days before being removed, during which time the community maintained the kind of careful silence that had protected them from involvement in family conflicts that could have resulted in their own elimination if they had been perceived as taking sides or showing excessive curiosity about events that were none of their business. The federal investigation that had been built around Thomas's testimony collapsed immediately following his death, as the primary witness, whose cooperation had made prosecution possible, was no longer available to provide courtroom testimony that could support criminal charges against individuals whose guilt could not be proven through other forms of evidence that had been gathered during the investigation. The physical evidence that had been collected by federal agents was insufficient to support prosecutions without witness testimony that could establish the connections between material evidence and specific criminal activities that would satisfy the legal standards required for successful prosecution of defendants who possessed the resources to mount sophisticated legal defenses. The file that federal agents had compiled on Pritchard family activities remained officially open, but practically inactive. containing substantial documentation of criminal activities that could not be prosecuted due to lack of witnesses whose testimony could survive the kinds of challenges that defense attorneys would present in court proceedings, where the credibility and reliability of witness testimony would be subjected to intensive scrutiny. The investigation had generated considerable knowledge about criminal operations, but had failed to produce the convictions that were necessary to disrupt those operations or deter similar activities by other criminal organizations that operated in regions where federal law enforcement faced similar challenges. The ledger of community silence grew thicker with the omission of Thomas and Clara's names from conversations and activities that had previously included them as accepted members of Highland society. Their elimination from collective memory, proceeding with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized other erasures that had maintained the Pritchard family's power through strategic amnesia and selective forgetfulness. The couple's former friends and neighbors adapted to their absence without public acknowledgement of loss or expressions of grief that might have been interpreted as criticism of family justice or sympathy for traitors who had violated the trust and loyalty that were essential for maintaining the social order that protected community members from external threats and internal discord. The story that survived in whispered conversations and coded references was not the official account of accidental fire and tragic loss, but rather the underlying narrative of betrayal and retribution that reinforced community understanding of the consequences that awaited those who chose cooperation with outside authorities over loyalty to local power structures that provided stability and protection through methods that operated outside the boundaries of conventional law and moral authority. The lesson was clear and unmistakable. In the Highland communities of 1907, some forms of knowledge were too dangerous to possess. Some truths were too threatening to speak, and some names were too powerful to invoke without risking the kind of permanent silence that eliminated problems before they could develop into existential threats to established order. The breaking of silence had been attempted and had failed, but the attempt had demonstrated both the vulnerability and the resilience of the system that protected the Pritchard family from accountability for their actions and consequences for their crimes. The failure of federal law enforcement to successfully prosecute the family, despite obtaining insider testimony and detailed evidence, had proven that their power extended beyond regional boundaries and local corruption to encompass the kinds of political influence and institutional protection that made them effectively untouchable through conventional legal processes that operated according to rules and standards that could be manipulated by those who possess sufficient resources and sophisticated understanding of system weaknesses and procedural limitations. The winter of 1908 that followed the elimination of Thomas and Clara Pritchard brought with it a silence so profound and comprehensive that it seemed to alter the very nature of sound itself throughout the Highland communities, where the family's influence had created a geography of fear that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of their property holdings to encompass entire regions where the mere mention of their name could still result in consequences that no reasonable person would risk for the temporary satisfaction of speaking forbidden truths or acknowledging realities that were better left unexamined by those who valued their continued existence and the safety of their families. The federal agents, who had invested months of dangerous undercover work in building a case against the Pritchard clan, found themselves reassigned to other investigations after the collapse of their primary prosecution strategy. Their superiors, having concluded that the resources required to maintain surveillance and investigative pressure on criminal organizations that operated in regions where local cooperation was unobtainable and where witness protection was practically impossible, represented an inefficient allocation of federal law enforcement capabilities that could be more productively employed in areas where Success was more likely, and where criminal convictions could be achieved without the extraordinary risks that had characterized the failed Ozark operation. Agent Samuel Richardson's final report on the Pritchard investigation became a classified document that was filed away in federal archives, where it would remain inaccessible to researchers and historians for decades to come. Its detailed descriptions of criminal activities and systematic corruption, serving primarily as a warning to future investigators about the dangers of attempting to penetrate criminal organizations whose power was rooted not just in violence and intimidation, but in the kind of community complicity that made conventional law enforcement techniques ineffective and potentially counterproductive when employed against targets that possessed superior knowledge of local conditions and social dynamics. The failure of federal intervention to disrupt Pritchard operations had demonstrated the limitations of centralized authority when confronted with criminal enterprises that had developed sophisticated methods for neutralizing external threats while maintaining the support and cooperation of local populations whose survival depended on their ability to coexist with powerful interests that could not be eliminated through conventional legal processes. The lesson learned by federal authorities was that some criminal organizations had achieved levels of integration with local communities that made them functionally immune to prosecution through traditional investigative methods and courtroom procedures that required witness cooperation and physical evidence that could not be obtained without community support. The Pritchard family's survival of serious federal investigation without suffering significant disruption to their operations had enhanced their reputation for invincibility and had reinforced community beliefs that they possessed supernatural protection or political connections that extended to the highest levels of state and federal government. The failure of well-funded and professionally conducted law enforcement efforts to achieve meaningful results against the clan had created a mythology of invulnerability that made future resistance even less likely, as community members concluded that opposition was not just dangerous, but futile in the face of power that exceeded anything that conventional authority could mobilize against it. The legend that emerged from the failed federal investigation was not the story of heroic law enforcement officers struggling against corruption and intimidation, but rather the narrative of inevitable defeat that awaited anyone who challenged the natural order of Highland society, where some families possessed authority that transcended legal boundaries and moral constraints that governed ordinary citizens. The story that was preserved in oral tradition emphasized the swift and certain retribution that had befallen the traitor who had broken faith with his adopted family, rather than the courage of investigators who had risked their lives to gather evidence against criminals whose activities had terrorized entire communities for years. The physical evidence of Thomas and Clara's elimination was gradually erased from the landscape through the systematic removal of ruins and debris that might have served as reminders of the consequences that awaited those who violated the codes of silence that protected the Pritchard family from external scrutiny and internal betrayal. The site where their home had stood was allowed to return to wilderness, with vegetation growing over the foundation stones and ash piles, until no trace remained of the dwelling where a young couple had lived and died as a result of their involvement in conflicts that exceeded their understanding and their capacity for survival in communities where knowledge could be more dangerous than ignorance. The bridge that had been sabotaged to prevent firefighting efforts was not repaired or replaced, leaving the access route permanently severed and creating a physical barrier that reinforced the psychological boundaries that separated the former location of Thomas and Clara's home from the community activities and social relationships that continued to function according to established patterns, despite the elimination of individuals whose presence had temporarily disrupted the careful balance. that maintained peace and stability in regions where open conflict could have catastrophic consequences for innocent families who lacked the resources to protect themselves or relocate to safer areas. The disappearance of Thomas and Clara from community memory proceeded with the same systematic thoroughness that had characterized other erasures that had maintained the Pritchard family's operational security over the years. Their names being removed, not just from conversations, but from official records and informal histories that preserved community knowledge about events and relationships that had shaped local development and social organization. Their marriage was forgotten, their property ownership was nullified, and their brief existence as members of Highland society was eliminated as completely as if they had never lived among the people who had known them during their short and ultimately tragic attempt to establish themselves as permanent residents of communities, where permanence was a privilege that could be revoked without warning or appeal. The church records that might have documented their marriage and residence were discovered to have suffered water damage that made the relevant entries illegible, while the county files that should have contained property deeds and tax assessments were found to be missing pages that had apparently been removed during routine maintenance procedures that could not be precisely dated or attributed to specific individuals who might have had reasons for eliminating documentary evidence of the couple's legal existence. The systematic destruction of official records demonstrated the extent of the Pritchard family's influence over institutions that were supposed to maintain permanent documentation of legal transactions and civil status changes that affected property rights and social relationships. The postmistress, who had previously handled mail delivery to Thomas and Clara's remote location, developed complete amnesia regarding their names and address, claiming that she had never served customers at that location and that her route had never included stops at properties that were too isolated and difficult to reach for regular postal service. Her selective memory loss regarding specific customers and delivery locations demonstrated the effectiveness of the informal pressure systems that encouraged community members to modify their recollections in ways that eliminated inconvenient facts and problematic knowledge that could create difficulties for people whose cooperation was essential for maintaining social stability and economic prosperity. The storekeeper, who had extended credit to the young couple and had sold them household goods and farming supplies during their brief residence in the community, discovered that his account books had suffered from an infestation of insects that had made the relevant entries unreadable. While his memory of specific transactions had been affected by a head injury that had occurred during a fall that he could not precisely recall, but which had resulted in gaps in his recollection of customer relationships and business dealings that had taken place during the period when Thomas and Clara had been active members of the local economy. The systematic erasure of Thomas and Clara from community memory was accomplished not through dramatic confrontations or explicit threats, but rather through the kind of gradual consensus building that reflected shared understanding of survival requirements in communities where collective amnesia was a necessary skill for maintaining the peaceful coexistence that enabled families to raise their children and pursue their modest ambitions without becoming involved in conflicts that could result in their own elimination or displacement. From regions where economic opportunities were limited and where social connections provided the foundation for security and prosperity. The children who had played with Thomas and Clara during community gatherings learned to avoid mentioning their names or asking questions about their absence, understanding through subtle cues and parental guidance that some topics were not appropriate for discussion, and that curiosity about missing people could create problems for entire families who might be perceived as showing excessive interest in matters that were none of their business. The education of Highland children in the arts of strategic forgetfulness represented an essential survival skill that was as important as traditional knowledge of farming, hunting, and woodcraft for successful adaptation to environments where social navigation required constant attention to unspoken boundaries and invisible dangers. The traveling preacher, who had conducted religious services, attended by Thomas and Clara, found that his memory of the couple had been affected by spiritual concerns that required his attention to focus on matters of eternal significance rather than temporal relationships that were subject to change and dissolution through processes that were beyond human understanding and control. His sermons during the months following their disappearance emphasized themes of divine justice and the importance of accepting God's will, even when human comprehension was inadequate to understand the purposes served by events that seemed tragic or incomprehensible from limited mortal perspectives. The deputy sheriff, whose patrol route had included the area where Thomas and Clara had lived, discovered that his official reports for the relevant time period had been damaged during a flood that had affected the county courthouse. While his personal recollections of incidents and investigations in that region had been clouded by health problems that had affected his memory and his ability to maintain detailed records of routine activities that had not seemed particularly significant at the time they occurred. His selective amnesia regarding specific events and individuals reflected the adaptive responses that law enforcement officers developed when their survival and effectiveness required careful attention to political realities that exceeded the authority and protection that official positions could provide. The Pritchard family's successful elimination of the threat posed by Thomas's cooperation with federal investigators had demonstrated their capacity to neutralize external challenges while maintaining the support and compliance of community members whose continued cooperation was essential for their long-term operational security and regional dominance. The lesson learned by potential opponents was that the family possessed resources and capabilities that exceeded those available to federal law enforcement agencies, making resistance not just dangerous, but futile for individuals or organizations that lacked equivalent power and influence. The legend that survived in whispered conversations and coded references was not a story of federal agents and criminal investigations, but rather a folklore narrative about the dangers of betraying family loyalty and violating the trust that bound Highland communities together in mutual protection against external threats that could destroy traditional ways of life and social relationships that had been developed through generations of adaptation to harsh environments and uncertain economic conditions. The moral of the story emphasized the importance of silence and discretion as survival skills that were essential for maintaining the delicate balance that enabled different interests to coexist peacefully, despite fundamental conflicts and competing objectives. The name Pritchard had achieved a status in Highland folklore that transcended mere identification of a criminal family to become a symbol of the kind of power that operated beyond conventional legal and moral constraints, while maintaining the support and cooperation of communities that understood the practical benefits of accommodation over resistance when confronted with forces that could not be defeated through conventional means. The family had become legend not through dramatic achievements or spectacular crimes, but through their systematic demonstration that silence could be more powerful than violence, and that community complicity could provide more effective protection than individual cunning or superior firepower. The winter silence that had settled over the Highland communities following the elimination of Thomas and Clara Pritchard would endure for decades to come, preserved not through fear alone, but through collective recognition that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge, and some names were too powerful to speak in regions where survival required constant attention to invisible boundaries and unspoken rules that governed relationships between ordinary citizens and the extraordinary forces that shaped their destiny through methods that operated beyond public understanding or official control. The deadliest clan in the Ozark.